Hi class, and welcome back for another lecture from Intro to Psych. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Consciousness. So this is a really interesting chapter because of all the chapters I teach on, I think this is the one that is still the most poorly understood as a science. And it's something that we are still working on, right? The idea of what is consciousness. So I would highly suggest coming into this with an open mind and not being too nervous about knowing all these definitions and what everything means totally, because we're still in the process of figuring it out. Now, when it comes to sleep and things, we do know that. But some things I do want you to think about during this lecture, right? What does it mean to have consciousness? Right? Do animals have consciousness, or is it a purely human phenomena? Do we think hypnosis is, and by real, I mean, does it work? Right? We know hypnosis is real in the sense that it does exist, but does it work? And then the question that has plagued me as a psychologist and actual therapist for years, what does it mean to have a dream, and what do our dreams mean? So this is all stuff we're going to talk about a little bit during this lecture, which honestly, I think it's going to be probably marginally shorter. I might live to regret that than some of our other lectures. But I think this involves a lot of in-class discussion, which I hope we'll get to do the coming weeks. So bring your questions to class, and let's go ahead and get started. So a couple quick announcements. As a reminder, I have my office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30, as well as by appointment. If you have questions about the class, psychology, anything like that, stop by. If you need some tutoring or just things aren't clicking for certain concepts, again, that's what office hours are here for. I usually end up sitting here working on other people's slides or other classes' slides, so do stop by and feel free to use that time. You have that time for engagement with your professor on things you're unsure about. Don't save those until exam day or the night before. Additionally, keep an eye on your syllabus dates. We have some papers, some reflection papers, as well as our first exam coming up in the relatively near future. So do keep that in mind. Now, where are we going today? Well, this is going to be a shorter set of things we're going to talk about. The chapter goes into a lot of detail on a lot of things. So I'm going to kind of keep it a little bit more specific. So the first thing we're going to briefly talk about is what is consciousness? What does it mean to have consciousness? We're then going to talk a little bit about processing without consciousness and what it means to process without conscious thought. And then we'll talk about some altered states of consciousness, including sleeping and dreaming, things like hypnosis, meditation, and then everybody's favorite, we'll talk some about some drugs. Again, this is not going to be a very complete chapter in what goes over what we talk about compared to the book. So do recognize this is actually a really good starting point, and the book is going to go into a lot more detail. So starting off about what is consciousness, the first question we have to ask as scientists is, how do our brains even make consciousness? So if we think about this, right, we see something. In this example, right, you see somebody with a dog walking. And somehow that information goes through your eyeballs, through a series of nerve endings, all the way to the back of your head, through all of that neuronal process of firing or not firing, stopping and going. And something happens right between there, the thalamus, our occipital lobe, where we actually interpret those objects. With these neurons right here, something happens, and then in our brain we go, oh yeah, it's a dog, right? I can think about my dog, or there's other dogs, this, that, and the other. This is literally a millennia-old problem, right? We call this the hard problem in consciousness and psychology, because how do you solve what is consciousness? How do we make this? Well, we can talk about two different ways that people in the past have thought about consciousness in the brain in and of itself. So when we talk about our brain and consciousness, we run into what we call the mind and body problem. And this is a question that you yourself have to decide where you fall in line on. And this is a philosophical question. And so the mind-body problem originally comes from a man called Descartes, also known for a lot of other things in philosophy. You've probably heard of him before. But he interpreted the mind and the body as two separate things. And he called this idea of dualism, right? Dual meaning two, right? If you were to duel somebody, it's you versus someone else. And this dualism, right, is the idea that the consciousness is a separate entity from the body, that the mind doesn't equal the brain. when you think about what that means, it's almost as if, right, we have something like a soul or something that stays around after we die is one way to interpret this. Another way we can interpret this is that it's like maybe not a living thing, but it is something that comes about from our brain's operation. Maybe it does disappear when we die, right? In the same way that right, our fingernails stop growing, or we stop breathing. But it's saying that this is a completely separate thing. That one may come from the other, but they are not the same thing. Whereas Hobbes down here, he believed in what we call materialism, right? In that the material of the brain is what is causing consciousness, right? So that consciousness results as a brain process, right? The material of the brain does this. And Hobbes, interestingly enough, really hated Descartes, which is just, interesting fun fact. But when we look at both of these, right, dualism, right, this idea that the mind and body are separate is almost kind of as if we are maybe being operated by a consciousness, or our mind is what some people might consider this. Other people might consider this to be, a moral component or things. And when we talk about this idea, in the past, we have thought that we can view and interact with brain events through the pineal gland for some reason. I'm not really sure where this theory came from. I think it was kind of an old school theory, right? Descartes was not exactly very recent in modern history. And for what it's worth, I really enjoy this guy giving the finger guns. But this position is actually more or less just completely ignored by modern psychologists. Not because some of them don't believe it, but when we talk about falsifiability, how do you prove the mind is different than the body? There's no real good way. So a lot of times, for most psychologists, we fall under a materialistic camp, right? That the mind is nothing more than a physical phenomenon resulting in the brain, that the mind is the body, right? This is just some result of all our neurons interacting. Do we have any evidence supporting this? Well, we do know that certain areas of the brain perform specific functions, and now we don't necessarily mean right, like phrenology over here. Pointing the wrong way. Phrenology over here is going to be the idea that all of these specific brain functions are found in these spots. But as we talk about things like Wernicke's area and Broca's area, right, we know that these are able to be used for specific things, but they are not forced to be. We can talk about neuroplasticity, or the fact that the brain can change. Right? We could theoretically, if we were completely unethical, right, poke around and take out specific parts of different people's brains and see when consciousness stops working. So that is going to be one way we can do this, but as that is completely unethical, we still don't know where consciousness comes from, actually. What's interesting up till now is I have yet to actually define the term consciousness for us, which is something I think actually is important to not do, because consciousness to each individual is a very unique concept. And that does not mean that everybody's definition is something I will take on an exam. But one thing you can think of with that is that consciousness means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And how we define it as psychologists is a subjective experience, right? Not objective. It's based on our own, right, experience of the world. And that we are aware of both what is going on around us and what is going on inside of us, both this external and internal portion of this. And we can use that information to organize our behavior. So it's not just the fact that we know, right, things are going on around us and inside us. It's the fact that we can have agency, you might call it, that we are agents of our own lives, that we have the ability to choose to do something. Now that gets to the question of, do we have a free will, which is something we will probably discuss during class, but that's its own set of issues, right? But if we are able to, right, feel that we're thirsty and think, hey, I haven't had a drink in a while, you should take a sip of this coffee. That is going to allow us to, be conscious and have change. So when we talk about this, the one thing I want to be clear about is what we mean by awareness, right? So awareness includes a lot of different things. We can be aware of our thoughts, our actions, our feelings, our sensations, These are just aspects of a mental process rather than a mental process on its own. Is it something that comes to our attention that we focus on? Is it something we are aware of or paying attention to? Some things we don't pay attention to. We don't pay attention to the fact that our blood pressure is being regulated or our temperature is being regulated unless we're sweating. But generally, the idea is that you have to be aware of what is going on and able to use that information to organize your behavior. And we can do this in a lot of different states. I like how the book talks about this on a spectrum from kind of very, very conscious to not conscious at all, maybe sleeping, or if you've been put under for wisdom teeth or some other surgery. And on the one end of the spectrum, we have the very, very awake or focused consciousness, right? And this is the waking consciousness, right? So a high degree of alertness, feeling alert and having our thoughts, feelings, and sensations be clear and organized. Now, we can be awake and our minds can be off somewhere else. And maybe we're not actually combining our feelings of, our thoughts, our feelings, and our sensations in a clear and organized way. Maybe I'm kind of just staring off into the distance and not paying attention to this lecture, as you may be doing right now. But we would say that is not full consciousness or not fully awake consciousness, because you're not totally alert, and maybe you're not feeling that your thoughts and what's going on around you is completely organized. Beyond that, we can kind of go down the gradient into what we call altered states of consciousness, or different forms of experience that go against what our normal consciousness is, and what that means for people. So what does it mean to have these alternate states of conscious? So we can talk about being mostly asleep, as when my wife tells me, hey, we need another bottle, and it's 3:00 in the morning, I'm more or less just like Frankenstein's monster. I'm just like, okay, and I just go and get it, and I don't really, I'm not alert. I'm barely having any thoughts other than, is this the right amount of water? Did I get the formula in? It's one level, but we can talk about being blackout drunk, on the other hand, or high off heroin or something, and how those are different states of consciousness because we are experiencing how the world is working around us differently. If you are so drunk that the world is spinning, that is an altered state of consciousness. The world is moving around in a different way than it actually is. Subjectively, not objectively. Everybody else sees the floor fine. In your mind, subjectively, that is how it looks. And think of how big of a role that's going to play on everything else. Not even just consciousness, but when we think of the types of thoughts we think about, how our subjective experience and what we think about and what we do, all of this plays a huge role on the mind. But that's outside the scope of this. So some other stuff we can talk about are the levels of consciousness. So the first one we can talk about is the idea of more or less how we can think of this as I can't think of the word, and it's right in front of me, a glacier or an iceberg, as they're called. And our conscious level is our degree of which we're aware of the mental events going on to us, and we have different levels. So we have a cognitive we have a cognitive conscious, we have a cognitive unconscious as well. So our cognitive conscious, we know, is our full mentally aware state. But we also have something that we can call the preconscious level. So this is stuff that's just hovering below the conscious level. This is oftentimes thought about like memory, Anything that you can kind of pull up is going to be in our preconscious. And this is going to be slightly below the surface, given the idea that our consciousness, all of it, is the iceberg here. Only the sum of it is above our awaking awareness, which is the waterline. And so the subconscious, or the preconscious level here, is going to be things that we can bring to our conscious level pretty easy. And so we can think of these mostly as the memories that come to mind pretty quickly, or the things pretty much in our head recently. So, did I feed my dog today? That's something that's probably pretty close to the surface for me, and that's going to be easy to recall. We can talk about the unconscious level that Freud would claim is very difficult to get to, but other people would claim that this could be conscious eventually or affect consciousness, but maybe we're not totally aware of it. Oftentimes, you'll hear this referred to as the unconscious or the subconscious, but both of those still mean the same thing, right? That this is kind of a lower level of consciousness that maybe we can bring it to awareness. So, right, maybe memories that we thought we'd forgotten until we watched a movie or talked about it with somebody, or, right, I like how Freud claimed, right, possibly grudges you don't even remember having might be an unconscious thing, right? Because that might affect your consciousness. You might not know why you don't like somebody, but you know you don't like them. And then we have what we call the non-conscious, so not conscious at all. The non-conscious is, again, stuff in our medulla, stuff in our pons, stuff in our cerebellum, right, like our balance and things like that. Right, our sense of direction, stuff like that we kind of know, but it goes on in the background, I should say. So I like to think of that almost like, here's a good example. So I went ahead and redid my next slide, so hopefully this makes sense. So consciousness can be broken down into different things, and I like to think about it kind of like a computer. And this analogy is not perfect, and it does break down at some point, but I think it's useful to get the bigger picture, kind of in the same way that it's useful to think of vesicles maybe as airplanes and neurotransmitters as passengers. The idea is that consciousness is kind of like the computer program you're using now. So if that's like your internet browser, or hopefully you are just watching this on YouTube, whatever it might be. But pre-consciousness is maybe those other programs you have open that you can switch into the background pretty quickly. Right? So if you have another window open or another tab open, it's pretty quick to get to that. It's pretty fresh on the mind. It's just below the surface. You also have your unconsciousness, which is maybe more like the programs you can open, maybe not all of them. So more of the things that you can get to. You can also think of this as maybe just a deeper level of pre-conscious here as well. This is, again, where it kind of breaks down. And the last one I talk about is the non-conscious is kind of like the task manager, and specifically, right, it's all those programs that are going on back behind the scenes that you don't even know are happening, right? Nobody knows what the System 32 is or things like that. But if you close them or damage parts of your brain, it's going to lead to a very bad time. So maybe we can think of consciousness a little bit more like this, and maybe that's helpful. If it's not, ignore the whole thing. So we also, we can think about, right, what we're aware of is part of consciousness, but are we able to process things without being conscious, right? Are we always conscious of what we're doing? No, absolutely not. So the book does a really great example about talking about things that maybe are automatic for us. So again, we're not always focused on breathing, but we know it happens. But even things that we can be conscious of, maybe we're not. How many times have you caught yourself maybe driving through right, town or wherever you are, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, how did I get here? Right? I must have gone through 2 or 3 lights, but what? So you're not conscious of that, but things are going on. One example of this, is, hopefully this works, is I saw this video. This is what a Tesla computer sees. And I think you guys can see it here, but you see all of this stuff that's going on behind the scene for the computer to help measure distance and things like this. Our brains do this too, all the time. Right? So we are making decisions, right? Is this person going to cross the street? Do I need to be worried about this? What are these cars doing? We're not conscious of this, right? Our eye movement, our brain activity, our nervous system, they all respond properly when they need to. But sometimes we're just not even paying attention and we're doing things behind the scene. So I think that's a good example of this idea of processing information without consciousness. Not only that, most of what we do is processed without consciousness. The fact that you can throw and pick up a pen, as I'm hopefully not going to drop it if I do it again, what happens there is you don't need to be consciously aware of exactly where it is. The back of your mind can do a lot of that judgment work. Where should my hand go so I can catch this, right? If you were playing baseball, right, you're standing there going, it's going to be right about here. You're better off maybe not letting your conscious thought take over, which could cause problems. Your conscious thought runs a lot slower. But one great example of how we can process without consciousness is this idea that we can call prosopagnosia. And so prosopagnosia is something that I maybe minorly have, or definitely think I did have in the past, but it's the idea that you might be unable to consciously recognize faces, including your own. Now, I could recognize faces, but I couldn't remember them, which is its own kind of questionable thing. But prosopagnosia people, right, they can't tell a face here from a face here. And this was famous from Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And Oliver Sacks talks a lot about some clinical psychology and neurology that happens, right? But these are people who are looking at, right, me or somebody else who, right, can recognize the fact that, that is a face, that is a person, but I don't know who it is. Maybe other things help them, right, recognize objects and people by voice. So if you wear the same shirt every day, it's probably easier for somebody with prosopagnosia to figure out who you are. And the weird thing is your body knows who it is. Your body will respond correctly, but your consciousness doesn't seem to. I have this test your ability here. It's at testmybrain.org. There's a short a short activity for that you can see how well you can, right, recognize people and faces. But understanding that right, processing that we do, this processing that we do, isn't exactly always conscious, and most of the time goes on behind the scenes. And with the thing like prosopagnosia, we learn a little bit about what happens when we have issues between our conscious brain remembering things and our body, right, who's already recognized this. How is it that we can see this person and know that it's somebody, but our consciousness doesn't fully get it? So that's an interesting thing, and something we will talk a little bit more about in class, hopefully. But moving on to the kind of last major portion of this, it seems like it's going to go pretty quick, but there's a lot to go under for all of these. So let's talk about the different altered states of consciousness. And we're going to start off by talking about sleeping and dreaming. So altered states of consciousness is just more or less the idea that we are in a different state, right, than whatever our normal subjective experience of the world is. And this is something that oftentimes people describe as changes that are great enough for you or other people to notice in how you function. So, right, this could be about, right, being asleep. This could be about being hypnotized. This could be, right, you being high on drugs, whether they be alcohol or other illegal drugs, or I guess legal drugs too, depending on where you are. And for all the things that I put up, think about what is going to cause, right, altered states of consciousness. What is going to cause altered states of consciousness? What is going to cause changes in thinking? Is it going to be sleep, things like hypnosis, taking drugs? Do any or all of those? What about disturbances in sense of time, feelings of loss of control, changes in emotional expression, alterations in body and body image and sense of self, and perceptual distortions? Right? For each of these, think about it, right? How do we get to an altered state of consciousness? The answer is probably a lot of these things can be done through a lot of, right, all of these. Right, we know for a fact that, right, sleeping or being sleepy, drowsy can make changes in your thinking and disturb your sense of time. You can, right, possibly, right, not even be aware what you're doing and come back to it later and be like, I felt like I was out of control. Grumpy people, right? And that's before we even talk about hypnosis and drugs, which we'll get to later. But recognizing that this is a very broad understanding of this. Our consciousness, that our normal state of consciousness is probably something we're in most of the time. However, we can alter it. Now, everybody knows the answer to this question. Do you get enough sleep? Probably not. I certainly know I'm not. But let's look at the human sleep pattern over time. So this is super interesting here. And let's take a minute to break this down. I think I can use this to make it a pen. Nope. To make it a laser pointer. Yes. Okay, so down here on our x-axis, we have how old people are. And this is not exactly to scale. Recognize that, right? This is a little bit different than exactly to scale. But we have, right, newborn babies, from infants up to, right, children, which we consider being at 2 years beyond, all the way to our adulthood and old age. Now we have our awake time here of 24 hours is up here. This is going to be a vertical graph, so how much time to 24 hours if you're awake or asleep. Down here we have what we call non-REM sleep, and we have REM sleep. And hopefully you know what non-REM and REM sleep are, because I won't bring them up until the next slide. So that's why you should read your book. So what's very interesting is that when we are newborns, we get almost 50% of our sleep from REM sleep. And notice that's 16 hours of the day. So my kid right now is slowly dropping off to maybe 40% REM sleep and only sleeping 14 hours a day, none of which happen to be the times I'm asleep. But the interesting thing is that goes away. Why? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but recognize that as young children, as newborns, we need very, very much amount of sleep compared to the elderly or even adults, right? Where adults need about 8 hours a day. Older adults maybe only need 6 or so hours a day. Whereas children, again, it is a kind of a gradual decline down here in when kids, or like how much time children spend in REM sleep. And we'll talk about what it means to have REM sleep here shortly. But recognizing that, one, if you're not devoting enough time to sleep, you're, one, doing yourself a disservice, as I know we all are. But two, you're also going to be hurting your functioning when it comes to doing well in college, really, in terms of your ability to make sense of the world, to make connections, to use a large amount of your cognition skills. Those are all impaired when you are not sleeping properly, especially if you're not getting enough REM sleep. All right, so keep saying REM sleep. What do I mean by that? Well, let's talk about the stages of sleep. Now, your book uses this chart down here, which is what I'm going to use. So how to look at this, this chart's a little bit odd. So we've got our hours of sleep on our x-axis at the bottom, so we know, right, as time goes on, we go that way. But we also have our stages of sleep. And this is weird because the deeper you go, the further down you go. You can almost think about this like a roller coaster, except being awake is at the top of the hill instead of the bottom. I mean, you can reverse it, I guess, if that makes sense to you, but I think it makes a lot of sense when we talk about deep sleep being the deepest part of the valley. So, we have a couple different ways, different stages of sleep, I will say. We don't have different ways to sleep. But the first stage of sleep is technically not a stage of sleep at all. It's being awake, right? So this would be our normal conscious level. And we call this, awake or being alert. So when we are alert, we have in our mind, mind is a scary word to use today. We have in our brain evidence of what we call beta waves. And beta waves are the brain activity, so the waves of activity that's going on in our head. There's chemical and electrical, I believe it's electrical signals here. And we know that those beta waves are for when you are alert, but the alpha waves, when you're starting to relax, those are when you are maybe starting to get a little bit sleepy. So when you're alert, when you're ready, when your parasympathetic nervous system is not active, when your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response, or just generally you are alert, ready to go, those are going to be your beta waves. Your alpha waves are going to be maybe more of your rest and digest, your parasympathetic nervous system. And it's not until we talk about drowsiness that we really see our brain pattern change majorly. This is truly the first sleep stage where we have what we call irregular theta waves. Now look at the difference between the waves right up here versus here. We see this is a large difference. And what this is going to do is really mark kind of our entrance into sleep. And so the drowsy stage is really that stage where you're just kind of fading in and out like this, where you're wake up, right? That's going to be your drowsy stage. It's not going to be when you actually jump up, which we'll talk about here in a second. So if you've ever had if you've ever seen somebody sleep, and I don't know how to say that without sounding like a weirdo, but you may have experienced this yourself. Sometimes you'll lay back, you'll go to sleep, and then all of a sudden you'll jolt awake as if you were falling, and jump up. So So that happens during stage 2 sleep. Stage 2 sleep is going to be when we're actually we've fallen asleep. We are now out, right? Instead of going from drowsy, we would now consider ourselves, lacking that level of conscious awareness that we have, right, when we are awake. And maybe you'd even call drowsiness its own level of consciousness. But it has two distinct patterns that you can see in the brain waves here. So you've got your normal parts over here and here, your theta waves. But here we have what we call sleep spindles. And sleep spindles are really heavy amounts of activity. Right? And look, they kind of look like what's going on up here a bit. Right? So it almost looks a little bit like what's going on up here or up there. And these are going to be our sleep spindles. Spindle is a word that means kind of like tightly bound together. So if you were to, take these from being this way to this way, they almost would be kind of like a really tight spring, right? Kind of pushed together. And that's how I remember spindles. K complexes, on the other one, are these big jumps we see here. And K complexes are possibly, we're not quite sure, responsible for kind of recognizing those things that are going on in our environment while we're asleep. And to me, right, one of my theories is, and what the book kind of talks about, is the idea that this might be what happens when, I sleep in the same bed as my spouse. So what if I'm falling asleep and I've gone to sleep and my spouse walks in and turns on the light? That might make a couple K complexes pop up because my brain's going, what's that? I'm still asleep, but my brain's feeling activity. As I'm going down, though, sleep is getting heavier and heavier, and it's harder to wake up out of that sleep. So then we move down into the third stage, the slow wave, and here we have delta waves. So these delta waves are high in amplitude, so they jump up and down pretty high, and they are, again, low in frequency like our theta waves. So they're not happening very, very frequently like the spindles over here, or our beta and alpha waves, but they are kind of just a little bit slower and a little bit larger. Now, stage 4 is going to be our slow wave. This is the deepest level of sleep. If you wake up somebody during this, they're going to wake up groggy and really confused, wondering what you are doing. So stage 4 is going to be all the way down at the bottom of sleep, and this is when you wake up and you don't know what year it is. And this usually takes about half an hour into a full night's sleep to really get to this stage. We do also see then that we stay in this deep amount of sleep. We might move up to stage 3 for a little bit and back down. But then all of a sudden, after give or take about an hour and a half of sleep, we rocket back up to above being drowsy, in terms of our activity. And these are what we call the REM stage of sleep. Congrats, we finally got to it. REM, or rapid eye movement. So REM sleep is the rapid eye movement stage of sleep where your body is locked in and the only thing that moves are your eyeballs. So I'm not going to get up close to the camera, but you can imagine looking around really fast with your eyes closed, going which way, and your eyes kind of just jiggle under there. So your eyes move, your eyelids are closed. What's interesting, though, is if you've ever met somebody who sleeps with their eyes slightly open, they are still moving their eyes underneath. It's really freaky. I've only seen it once in my life. But our muscles paralyze ourselves, except for our eyes, basically. We kind of lock ourselves into place, and then we fall, or we start dreaming. 90% of our dreaming happens during this stage. Now, that does not mean that you have to be dreaming during REM sleep, but when you do dream, it is likely in REM sleep. So remember that. Just because you're in REM sleep does not necessarily mean you're dreaming. We're not really sure on that yet. But the important thing to recognize is that REM sleep makes you look, your heart rate, your breathing, your blood pressure, you look like an awake person, but you're frozen, you're not moving. The only thing that's moving is your eyes. And after, a little bit closer to 2 hours, we drop back down into a deep level of sleep, and then we come back up. And the book uses this awake level here, which I have never seen before. They argue that we might kind of briefly just come to the surface of consciousness Sometimes we might wake up, sometimes we might not, and it really might just be a brain pattern activity that we don't even recognize on a conscious level of us waking up before falling back to sleep. But this happens over and over and over again until towards the end of the night, we see more in deeper, much more REM sleep for longer periods, much less deep sleep. And I want you guys to be able to answer for me when we come to class, why? Why would this work that way? So why is it that we get more REM sleep later in the night and less REM sleep at the beginning? Why is it that we get more deep sleep at the beginning of the night and less deep sleep later on? So be able to do that. We can also talk about some other stuff regarding sleep, right? Why do we sleep? Well, we know we have a biological clock, our circadian rhythm, which is about it. So circadian rhythm works as a biological clock that tries to keep us in about a 24-hour time cycle to wake up and fall asleep, to make us not nocturnal, to make us dayturnal. So one thing about this is we don't know exactly why we sleep. We know there's a lot of animals that do, some that don't. And of the animals that do, they tend to be the smarter animals. They tend to be the ones with the more complex cognitive capabilities. But we don't really know why we sleep. We do know that if you don't sleep, it can have extremely negative impacts on your life. You can, there's a family, ironically named the Doze family, Doze, and they have a series of genes apparently that for some of their family members, once they turn about 40 or 50, I believe, they stop sleeping. They just stop sleeping forever. And that eventually leads to their death several years later, often because we cannot function properly without sleep for very long times. So why do we sleep? Well, a couple functions. One is that it helps to restore our brain and our body for our future activity. So this makes a lot of sense. If you've been working all day, it's important to put your body to rest a little bit, let you feel better, maybe take a load off for a while. But not only that, when we say restore brain and body for future activity, well, one thing we can do with that is think back to glial cells. And with glial cells, those are going to be the cells that help maintain our neurons in the rest of our brain. So one thing that's going on here is while we're restoring and our brain and our body, we are also fixing everything up. We're making sure everything looks good. We are making sure those brain connections are good, that everything is working there. We are also restoring our neurotransmitter sensitivity. If you think about that we would be going all day long, telling these neurons to stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. Eventually, we might build up a tolerance to that level of neurotransmitter, we need more of it to get the same thing. In the same way, you may need more and more coffee if you keep drinking it, After a while, 1 cup's not doing it, you need 2. Taking a break to be able to let your sleep or your neurons during sleep rest is a huge factor that keeps the tolerance and lets us continue to use the same levels of neurotransmitter. We don't need more and more and more. The last one is actually technically a little bit controversial for me to say. So there's a couple theories on dreaming, and I believe we talk about a couple of them here, but I would argue that this allows us to solidify and assimilate the day's experience. So almost like putting it all together and making sense of it. We know from studies, if you sleep before you take an exam after you've learned material, it seems to allow your mind to put it into a deeper place in your memory. It seems to let it marinate, as some people say, or let you think about it for more time. It takes time to do this, recognize. We can't do this while we're awake. There's too much going on. So maybe this is a way for us to add what we've learned today to our experience. And you can probably recognize this. If you don't sleep, you probably aren't going to remember everything. Plus, you're already tired, which is a problem. So one thing to also notice is that with REM sleep, we've kind of talked about it. We don't know exactly why we have REM sleep. Part of it might be to dream, and part of dreaming has several beliefs. But one thing I'd like to talk about briefly is REM rebound. So REM rebound is this idea that you can have sleep debt. And sleep debt is really, really bad. Sleep debt is going to actually cause you to have lower functioning, lower ability to do what you need to. And if it's lower than your normal, you might run into an even worse sleep debt. And a sleep debt is this idea that we are not getting what we need. We are taking from the bank of sleep without depositing enough. And as you see here with these dotted lines, for about 220 days, people kept track of their sleep here, so better part of a year. And what they noticed is that if they had a night, right, where they had some sleep debt, what happens is they eventually, and here's kind of the average, they eventually have lower REM the next night, but they need to pay it back somehow, and their brain kicks into REM faster. So you might be saying, okay, so then I'll just not sleep, and then my brain will go straight to REM. That's pretty good. Well, what does all this do? Right? It helps our brain and body restore for future activity. Our REM is only, right, one part of this. If you're right, if you only sleep till 2 hours and you do the all REM stage, look at everything you're missing here. Are you missing, right, the ability to make these changes with your neurotransmitters or make these, new connections or maintaining connections? Are you able to do this? Probably not, because you are going to be down in sleep. It's not like REM is the only important thing. We've definitely evolved for sleep to matter more than that, but if we're not treating our bodies right, that's going to have a profound effect on our consciousness and a lot of other things as well. So we've talked a bit about REM, which is where dreams happen, but let's talk a bit about dreams and dreaming. So what's the purpose of dreaming? Don't we all want to know? I'm really tempted to just make a video one time where I'm like, so the purpose of dreaming is, and then just pause it and then be like, so anyways, if you have any questions, let me know. But I won't do that here. So the idea is that with lucid dreaming, or excuse me, that's our first one. The purpose of dreaming, we don't really know. So dreaming happens, and we have some theories, but we're not sure. Well, one thing we can talk about that's interesting that we know is people lucid dream. So lucid means like clear and awake and alert. So if you're lucid, right, so you hear this often talked about in, not very happy, but Alzheimer's patients, that maybe if they have a, quote, really good day, right, that they all of a sudden know who everybody is and know what's going on around them. We call that a lucid moment or a lucid kind of state of mind. Well, sometimes we can have those in dreams. I've had this happen once to me where I had a lucid dream and I recognized I was in a dream dreaming, which is really cool. I don't know what my conscious state would have been there, but it was interesting. So we do know that we can manage to break into our dreams somehow, and there are ways in which you can make yourself more likely to do lucid dreaming or less or whatever. But why do we dream? Well, not really sure. From a psychoanalytic standpoint, Freud claimed that one thing we did was we used dreams as wish fulfillment. So what do we mean by that? So Freud claimed that a lot of the human condition was really brought down to the fact that we had our id, our ego, and our superego kind of fighting for control of ourselves. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Freud. But the idea is that one thing Freud claimed is that when we dream, we are trying to make something come true that maybe we think is too terrible to come true in real life, or we don't think it can happen, or we're just trying to express our wishes. And dreams would be disguised as this in ways that maybe we can't see. And Freud talked about two different types of content in a dream. He talked about the manifest content of a dream. So imagine I have a dream where my teeth fall out. And yes, this is a common dream. Some of you may have actually had this dream. I do not, but I know people who do. So what if I had a dream where my teeth fall out? Well, let's talk about the content of that dream, right? I can say, Dr. Freud, I was dreaming and I took a sip from my tea and my teeth hurt and they all broke apart and fell out of my mouth, and I looked in the mirror and I had no teeth. Well, Freud would look at that and he would first talk about the manifest content of that dream. He would say, well, let's talk about how that dream is being represented in your mind, how it's manifesting, how it's coming to being as it is. And he would say, so where were you? What was going on? What did it look like? Was there anybody else there? And we can talk about this manifest content, this idea of that's what it shows up as. But Freud claimed that deep inside that I was dealing with some unconscious issues. And he might say that the latent or underlying meaning or kind of hidden meaning, what latent means, the latent content of this dream might be related to the fact that he would probably claim I had an oral fixation because, I say, he thinks, because, your mouth is part of the oral fixation. It might be that you spent too much time as a child being weaned off a bottle too young of an age, and maybe now you just wish that you had some way to get back to that moment, to be a kid again and just be able to suck on your thumb and do all the, it's crazy. But the idea behind that is Freud claimed what our dreams were symbolic for other things. So a man with an umbrella, he claimed was, you can imagine what an umbrella could theoretically look like if you held it in a certain way. He claimed that a closed umbrella was a sign of a man wishing he was more masculine for certain reasons. But enough about that theory. I don't really like it. Another theory we can talk about is a purely biological theory. And this is the idea that dreams are just what happens when our brain tries to reset itself in the way of maintaining connections. So that, hey, randomly some stuff fires and the brain tries to just make sense of it. It doesn't need to be anything specific. So the activation synthesis idea is that our brain activates our neurons and we synthesize that at some level to mean something when it actually doesn't. So this would be like seeing a picture or seeing something in a cloud when there really isn't anything there, that our brains are just making it up as they go along. And the last one is the activation information model, and this is a cognitive model. And this is the idea that information and our standard processes that are used during waking hours, so all of our normal stuff that's going on during waking hours can influence your dreams. And so activation information mode. So it is taking our activation of our neurons and the information we've learned to kind of bring those together. Now, I don't know if you guys agree with this, but in my personal experience, my dreams have frequently dealt with things that are going on currently in my life, whether it's a stressful or non-stressful situation. There always seem to be elements of regular day, pretty recent stuff that's happened to me. So if I were to take a trip to Orlando to go, I don't know why I'd take a trip to Orlando for right now, but say I would, in my mind, I might be driving down the highway in a dream because I drove to Orlando. Now, that's again an anecdote. That doesn't necessarily mean what I'm saying is 100% true, but it is an interesting way to think about that. Now, I will put this in the link below, but you can also just Google VSauce dreaming. This is a really cool video on why we dream. If you'd like to see anything else, I'm not going to make you watch it. It's not required, but if you are interested in this, something cool to look at. So interestingly, that's all we have to talk about with dreams, is that why do dreams happen? Well, they're probably useful. Beyond that, we don't really know. But what we do know is there's a lot of problems with sleep, and people have a lot of problems with sleep. And there are a lot of disorders that cause people a lot of problems because they can't sleep right, and that deals with their consciousness. The first one we can talk about is pretty easy. It's insomnia, the idea that you can't fall asleep or you can't stay asleep once you do fall asleep. This is the most common sleep disorder. To be diagnosed with it, you need to have it last more than 2 weeks. Just because you're tired for a week or so, not necessarily. Recognize also that this is related to mental distress and impaired functioning on your daily tasks. If you're not sleeping well, you might not be able to drive very well. This can actually lead to symptoms of depression and anxiety. And we do see kind of a correlation between insomnia and depression and anxiety symptoms. Now, is that saying that depression and anxiety cause insomnia or the reverse? We're not really sure. Beyond insomnia, we can have narcolepsy, which is really the opposite, right? Instead of not being able to fall asleep or stay asleep, it's not being able to stay awake. Narcolepsy is this abrupt switch from waking consciousness to REM sleep. Now remember, what happens in REM sleep? You get paralyzed. So if you're standing up, right, you just go. You are down. So with narcolepsy, these people are actually, they're in a very precarious situation, right? How are you supposed to move around and do these things without your body, right? Without knowledge that your body is going to just not freak out on you and not going to just, right, as you're walking across the lobby in a nice hotel, that you're not going to fall and smash your head on the tile, something like that. So recognizing that narcolepsy is another disorder, but it's actually about your brain just saying, yeah, it's time to sleep. Now, this doesn't last forever. You can usually wake the person up pretty quick, but again, this is a very interesting thing. Another thing we see is sleep apnea. So sleep apnea is briefly stopping breathing during sleeping, and you awaken just long enough to resume breathing. Problem with that is you don't feel well rested at the end of the night. In the same way that, as we talked about earlier on the slide with the different levels of brain activity, the stages of sleep, you would basically stay almost at that awake level almost all the time. You would keep jumping back to this, maybe like 100 times a night. And so you don't feel well rested. So the things that we know we can do for this is you can get a CPAP machine. I believe it's a CPAP machine, but the idea is that it shoots a little bit of air up your nose, which keeps that breathing regular and allows you to sleep. Because even if you're not aware that you're waking up to just and fall back asleep, that's going to be hard to stay in that deep level of sleep and causes problems. Now, this one is terrifying as a new father, right, is SIDS. SIDS is Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. How terrifying of a name. How does it happen? We don't know. Why does it happen? We don't know. Is there a way to detect it? Sudden. We don't know. We just know that sometimes infants die during their sleep. Why? Man, this is scary. But it's usually between children who are 2 to 4 months old. And some part of this might be suffocation from sleeping face down. If you learn nothing else about a baby, one of the most important things is they should always sleep belly up. Back on the ground, belly up, not on their side, not on their belly, and don't put anything near their face. The idea is that with kids, young children, right, babies, what might be happening here is the fact that they are not recognizing that they're taking in too much CO2 is one theory. So if I don't have a baby blanket here, which I usually do. If, for instance, I'm falling asleep with a blanket on my face, maybe eventually as an adult, I know to kind of whap it away. As a kid, I might not be able to do that. Some other things that cause this too are cigarette smoke. Secondhand smoke for kids is really, really bad, especially when they're that young. It increases the likelihood of sudden infant death syndrome. Not only that, having a low birth weight, so being born prematurely could cause this. We're not really sure, but it's clearly there might be something wrong with the brain systems in regulated breathing for kids. But again, it's still unsure. So some other sleep disorders, though, the one that most people also know, sleepwalking, right? This is walking during non-REM sleep. This is most common in children, actually. Kids tend to sleepwalk more than adults. We don't really know why kids do this. We're not really sure. Again, it's hard to make people sleepwalk. We just kind of know if they're going to or not. We can also talk about another one, which is kind of like sleepwalking, but it's different. This is called REM behavior disorder. So the idea is that our normal REM paralysis is absent. Instead of being stuck there with your body frozen and your eyes moving, your whole body can move. And that person can act out dreams. And as your book says, this might actually be something where somebody could kill a spouse, not realizing that it was a dream. They thought it was real. And there have been instances where this does happen. So recognizing that the reason we hold ourselves basically paralyzed during that time is so we don't run into issues like this. Jim Gaffigan has a great bit about the fact that he has I forget if it's a REM behavior disorder or just sleepwalking in general. But I think the last two we're going to go over, are nightmares, which are frightening REM dreams. So these are just frightening dreams that happen during REM. And night terrors, which are different. These night terrors happen during stage 4 of sleep, our deepest level of sleep. And this is where you wake up completely panicked. And what they say is an intense emotional arousal. So you just feel, right? You just feel the feeling of usually this terrible emotion, right? It's not actually, right? So it's not actually a dream in and of itself, right? So if you have a bad dream where you're getting chased by somebody, that's one thing. You can wake up and go, oh, that scared me. But a night terror is actually just your body being like, hey, you're afraid. You're going to feel what true fear feels like right now. By the way, wake up. And you have no memory of why you felt that way. You have difficulty calming down afterwards. But it's not a dream. It's just the feeling, which is really unique. So, night terrors are not dreams. Night terrors are your body just making you feel an emotion at an extreme level. And it's almost, I believe in this case, it's always bad. I don't know if they're positive. Like night, the opposite of terror is like pleasantries. Yeah, so recognize that with sleeping and dreaming, there's a lot to understand. And there's a lot to understand for you, and there's a lot to understand that we still need to do as psychologists to really dig deep and get all of this and make sense of why we dream, why we sleep. So let's move into hypnosis and meditation. It's going to be much shorter, but I still think is really interesting. So meditation and hypnosis are both considered altered states of consciousness. Hypnosis, we would call this being brought on by various techniques of suggestion that can change behavior. Now, what's interesting about this is not everybody can be hypnotized. About 10% of the population is unable to be hypnotized. But we do know some things about people who are able to be hypnotized. They tend to be more imaginative. They tend to have higher fantasy proneness, so daydreaming and things of that sort. They tend to be able to focus attention for long periods of time and process information quickly and without effort. And think about why those might be useful, right? If you're imaginative and you fantasize about big and crazy things, maybe you're more likely to be focused or more likely to be hypnotized. But when we talk about this focused aspect, if you're sitting there looking at whatever they are swinging in front of your face and you're distracted easy, you're like, all right, I'm not going to pay attention, you're less likely to be hypnotized. If you are somebody who processes info quickly and without effort, you're more likely to be hypnotized. If you're somebody who likes to think about why and explain things, you might be less likely to be hypnotized. Well, the cool thing is hypnosis does a lot of good. We know that hypnosis can help people reduce chronic pain. We know that, and I know somebody who went to a hypnotist to stop smoking and quit just that day. And I think stopped I think it's been like 10 years now. I have to check up on them. But the idea, is that for some reason, some people who can be hypnotized, it's not everybody who can be hypnotized, can remove bad habits, improve memory. This I'm going to say is a big fat no. And I think it's important to recognize that I do put this on here, but you do need to listen to me when I say, it's not necessarily improving memory. Part of that is the idea that hypnotic suggestions or hypnotic kind of uncovering of your childhood. We don't know if you're making that stuff up on the spot, maybe because you have an overactive, or you're asked to imagine this and you don't know, right? Or is it the case where you are bringing up these repressed memories or other things? We don't know, and it's not considered a admissible thing in courts to talk about like an assault that happened that was only brought up during hypnosis. That's not going to help. That's not going to be used in a court of law because we're not sure if that is a suggestion or not. We're not sure if that's true or a suggestion. Therapy is an interesting one because while we can't use this in a court of law, we know that, I'm sorry, I really didn't talk about the memory portion of that. You're not really going to be able to improve your memory. That's just kind of what it is. Therapy, on the other hand, we do know that hypnotic suggestions can maybe decrease a sense of stress, decrease feelings of anxiety, and maybe do some good, but again, not for everyone. So we do know that hypnotic suggestions can reduce nausea and vomiting for patients who are in chemo. It actually reduces the amount of surgical bleeding, and it decreases, I guess, post-operative recovery times, making them shorter, which is what we want. That's really interesting because I don't know how it is that thinking hypnotically can make you less likely to bleed during surgery, but we know it works. So all of a sudden, we can talk here about how hypnosis does these things. But psychologists aren't really sure why or how. There's a couple theories in your book talks about them. Make sure you know the basics of those. So with hypnosis, recognize that it is something that we do know does work, right? We can hypnotize people. Some people can keep suggestions they've been given, right? Not smoking for years. Some people can't, and some people can't be hypnotized. So it's something that we're not really sure of today, and it still needs to be really better understood before I feel comfortable making any claims, to be honest. Now, meditation, on the other hand, is kind of like hypnosis, but it has a lot more backing and is a lot easier to do. Meditation is simply focusing on a single target to increase awareness of the moment. What is going on right now? What is cool about that is how you often see this done is through what we call body scan meditation, right? So first think of your feet and feel them and feel how they are. Then think of your legs kind of moving up. We can talk about breathing meditation. So watching your breath come in and out. And we know this is a very useful tool. This is something that comes from Buddhism and more Eastern religions. But it has been embraced by psychologists now in some part due to its benefits. We know that experienced meditators show unique patterns of brainwaves while meditating. These are different than what normal or new meditators do. And we know that meditating is associated with a better capacity to cope with a lot of life stressors. When you are stressed, it's very useful to be able to meditate, pay attention to the moment, not your stressors, and to focus out of that, right? To kind of get your head cleared. So one way we can do this is what we call mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation is some type of meditation that I've looked into as a researcher and found some interesting findings with mindfulness. So mindfulness is the idea that we want to be mindful. We want to pay attention to what is going on, but we don't want to judge our actions. So if we think, right, say you are meditating and my instructions to you are, hey, just pay attention to the thoughts that you see go through your head. Try not to engage them. Don't really go into them. Just let them go by, and don't get upset at them, right? So if a thought comes by your head as you're sitting there quietly and you say, I can't believe Melissa did that to me. How rude, right? You could go, yeah, I can't believe it. Oh, I'm so upset. Or you can just, okay. And as my friend once said, you can imagine this like a leaf floating down the river as it gently passes by. It sounds like a bunch of hokey stuff. All I know is every time that I have meditated, I have felt clearer afterwards. I have felt better. And mindfulness meditation is a very useful tool, especially for people who are stressed. We see that it lowers rates of depression in individuals if they tend to use a lot of mindfulness. So, recognizing that both meditation and hypnosis are altered states of consciousness, one of which we can get to pretty easy, meditation, but hypnosis is something that does get us to an altered state of consciousness. And what it does, we do find things that it does, but findings are also a little mixed. Finally, the last thing we'll talk about, drugs. So, what makes something a drug? We take drugs all the time, right? If you take aspirin, if you take, right, acetaminophen, I think is the other one, ibuprofen, whatever, you're taking a drug. Is water a drug? Probably not. Is coffee a drug? Absolutely. It's got caffeine in it. Is Coke a drug? It's got caffeine in it. Is heroin a drug? Doesn't got caffeine in it, but yes, it's a drug. So what makes something a drug? Well, as a psychologist, one way we can define this is psychoactive drugs. So a chemical substance that alters thinking, perception, or memory. That's a pretty broad definition. So some kind of substance that alters thinking, perception, or memory. Would you argue that food is a drug because it maybe alters you from being hangry to not? I wouldn't, but we could maybe make that claim. But not only that, one thing that we talk about this is that it's going to alter our conscious state. And the interesting thing is, drugs can cause dependencies, as you have likely heard. However, we can talk about the difference between a physical or a psychological dependence on a drug. So the thing that I think is important to recognize here is that a physical dependence on a drug is literally that if you do not take it, your body will have physical withdrawals, whether that be that your mind, it's all in your head, whether your body physically shakes. These are all types of withdrawals. One thing I've heard of is people who take SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or things like Lexapro. These actually, if you stop them cold turkey, people claim that you get what is called, they've heard them termed the zaps. And this is a really interesting phenomenon because most of you have probably felt this. If you've ever been, again, halfway asleep and you kind of turn your head and it makes kind of a zap, it almost feels like kind of like a jolt of electricity across your head. People who are taken off SSRIs, instead of weaned off, right? Just like, nope, no more, which is not a good thing to do. They claim that this is a very common side effect of these zaps. And so, they are having issues with the way they're able to perceive the world, because when they're turning their heads or they're closing their eyes and opening, their brain's kind of But that's a physical dependence. We can also talk about a psychological dependence. So a psychological dependence, this is all in your head, technically. This is that you feel that you need the drug. A placebo can cause a psychological dependence if you think you need it. So say, you were somebody taking SSRIs or a placebo of an SSRI, and you get cut off. You probably aren't going to experience the zaps, though you might, due to placebo effect. But what you may experience is this belief that you are something bad is going to happen because you are psychologically dependent on this. Now, marijuana is a drug we talk about a lot in the modern discourse. We know alcohol is a drug, and we know alcohol has a lot of negative effects. And we know alcohol causes both a physical and psychological dependence on some people. Alcoholics, literally, if they stop drinking it, their hands will shake, but they also have a psychological dependence on it. But marijuana doesn't have a physical dependence. If you smoke marijuana every day, all day, as Snoop Dogg would want, you would not physically suffer if you quit cold turkey. But you would probably mentally suffer. it is a mentally addictive drug, and I think that's something that goes under the radar for a lot of people, is the idea that, right, while it is not physically addicting, it can be something that causes you to maybe take more of it than you wanted in a given time, to, right, basically like not be able to live without it. And that's not good. Nothing in life, right? You shouldn't have a physical or psychological dependence on any substance, but I mean, coffee is life. But again, what counts as a drug and how legal they are is open to a huge amount of interpretation by culture, within culture, and really, we also have these very broad categories of drugs. So I'm going to talk about stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenics specifically. And one thing I want you to know is I have these broken up in a way that was given to me before, and they mostly fit. However, recently, and I'll bring this up again, marijuana has actually been moved into being both a stimulant, a depressant, and a hallucinogen, where it used to be only categorized mainly as a depressant. But, right, not all of these fit neatly into their own little groups. Some of them fit into multiple categories, marijuana especially. So let's talk about depressants first. The depressants are going to depress or reduce our nervous system. So what do we mean by that? Well, they are going to decrease our ability to function or use our nervous system. So we see alcohol causes a decrease in function in the cerebellum, causes a decrease in your ability to make good decisions. It causes a decrease in your ability to walk. Things like tranquilizers or narcotics actually are all considered depressants because they reduce or depress the nervous system. Now, on the other hand, we have stimulants, which increase nervous system activity, right? It's stimulating. Some examples of that are amphetamines, cocaine, caffeine, nicotine. Now, one thing to note here, and your book kind of talks about it a little, is that one type of amphetamine is something that kids love to abuse, and that's Adderall. Adderall is an amphetamine. It comes from the amphetamine line. Right? That does not mean it's meth, right? Methamphetamine is different. Does that mean it's not meth? It's not meth, but it's kind of close to meth, to be quite honest with you. Like, the chemical compositions are not that different. Doesn't mean you should go do meth. It's even worse. But the idea here is that what these are doing for people is they are upping their nervous system activity. They're making them more jittery. They're making them more excited. They often are implementing the sympathetic nervous system, making you more fight or flight. And these are going to increase the central nervous system. They're going to raise your heart rate. They're going to raise your blood pressure. They're going to increase norepinephrine and dopamine outputs. And these are going to generally lead to just really kind of jittery times. Another one we can talk about, I guess we're going to talk about more than that, is opioids. So opioids induce what we call euphoria, or these great, wonderful feelings. They can also help people sleep and relieve pain. We have some opioid receptors in the body, but not many, actually. Most of them, we can create opioids in the body, but not a lot of them. And they have a really complex effect on consciousness. So for instance, opium poppy contains opium, contains codeine, it contains morphine, it contains heroin, or the ability to make from these things. We can talk about Oxycontin or other drugs which have been devastating to communities dealing with the opioid crisis, and how we see what that does for people, right? We know heroin kind of lowers your state of being. It kind of makes you relax to the point where you might slump over and just kind of sit like this. But apparently it feels really, really good. And that is not a good way to say that, Kyle. It's bad for you. And heroin is the one I've heard is like, if you touch that, you're just in not very good shape. So the last one, as I quickly move on from that, is hallucinogens. So hallucinogen, think about the word hallucination, right? So causing altered perceptions of reality. And some examples of that include things like LSD or PCP, ketamine, marijuana, which technically covers a lot of these, And remember the story I told you guys about my stepmom, right? So my stepmom, she has depression. She has severe depression. She's in a ketamine treatment. And what they do is they give her, right, a microdose of ketamine. And this is delivered to her intravenously, and she lays there for about an hour, and there's a short recovery time afterwards. And what we know is that it really helps her depression, and that's kind of what the research says. But the cool thing is, my stepmom said the first time she took it, she got to fly over India with Jesus, because that was not what was happening in that hospital bed. She was hallucinating that. And apparently, not only, right, do you hallucinate that, but it also might do some cool stuff to brain chemistry that we're not quite figured out yet to help decrease symptoms of depression for a while. All right, everybody, so that is what we are going to talk about today. That was everything. A couple quick announcements, right? Office hours, make sure you're paying attention to what you need to be paying attention to. Check those syllabus dates. Again, if you need anything, please do reach out. I'm happy to help. Otherwise, I hope this was easy enough to follow. If you have any questions, I think I already said that. Anyways, have a great day and enjoy.